Goodbye, Mikonos. So here we have some orangutans enjoying themselves.
Yes, we do.
Isn't that the president of Lewis College? There goes Mikonos. Here we are missing a rock.
That's good.
We're surfing on these waves. They're right behind us.
Delos is a hill, a rocky hill, granite rock in fact, known as the Kinthus Hill. On the summit were found the remains of some prehistoric dwellings belonging to the first people that inhabited the area around 3000 BC, and they were known as the Carians, and they chose the highest spot of the island in order to protect themselves from pirate raids, something very common at that time. Now, the real history of Delos will start much later with the arrival of the Ionians, a Greek tribe that will bring on the island of Delos at around 1100 BC the religious belief of this god of light, god of purity, god of the arts, god of tolerance, god of moderation, and his qualities do not end. In fact, the most spiritual of all the gods of ancient Greek mythology, and that was god Apollo. So Delos was considered to be the birthplace of this god of light, god Apollo. Now there's still a big question mark. Why did the ancient Greeks choose among other islands much larger, this otherwise insignificant little island, to become the birthplace of such an important god? The answer could be the level of sun radiation on the island, which is exceptionally high. And I think you will usually experience this during the visit. Now, if you come here in autumn, for example, and there are clouds all over the place, Delos is nearly always standing below a sunny hole. And that is due probably to a microclimate which is particular to this area, and that explains this phenomena. But anyway, the ancient Greeks had noticed that, and because they always tried to ally the personality of their god with the landscape, they needed, as you understand, for the birthplace of the god of light, a place which would be bathed in light, and that seems to have been Delos. In any case, we know that already from the 8th century BC we have the development of an important sanctuary here dedicated to that god, and we know that the main masters of that sanctuary will nearly always be the Athenians, who will build the 3 temples of Apollo and will pass in the 5th century BC this famous purification law, according to which nobody had from then on the right to be born or to be buried on the island of Delos. The argument was that because this island was the birthplace of the god of purity, the acts of birth and death were supposed to dirty, to soil the land. So a pregnant woman about to give birth, a sick person about to die, or a corpse, were immediately rushed over to the island that is the opposite, which is twice as large as the island of Delos, and known as the Big Delos or the island of Rhenia. And that's where people were born, that's where they were buried, according to that purification law. And what is most amazing is that even when Christians will come here later, they will never bury their dead here. So they will respect to some extent that law. Now, towards the end of the 4th century BC, with the decline of Athens, we have another Greek tribe that emerges from the north of Greece, and you have heard of the Macedonians, Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, and their successors, the Ptolemies of Egypt, who will acquire control for some time of Delos. Under the Macedonians, Delos will start to develop into a commercial center, and that due to its port, which will become a transit harbor for grain at the beginning. Now, the peak of the commercial development of Delos will appear in the following period with the arrival of the Romans. Beginning of the 2nd century BC, the Romans conquer most of the ancient Greek city-states and island states, and they will come here. Now, they will declare the port of Delos a tax-free port, and that is exactly what will boost the economic activity of the island, which will experience a golden period of less than a century, beginning of the 2nd till beginning of the 1st century BC, when Delos becomes one of the major transit harbors of the eastern Mediterranean. Amazing thing if you consider the size of the island. Now, the commercial development attracted a lot of people who decided to establish themselves on the island. And you have Greeks from Greek colonies that come here, but you have also the so-called Oriental people, and these are Egyptians, Phoenicians, Syrians, Jews, who bring along with them their religious beliefs. And the Romans that live here represent approximately 1/3 of the people living. So it was a very important part of the population. The entire population of the city that developed at that time numbered approximately 25 to 30,000 inhabitants. But as I said, it was a very short development that lasted less than a century. And the city that they built surrounded the sanctuary of Apollo, which occupies the whole central valley of Delos. Now, the people living here were mainly merchants. We had bankers, we had ship owners, and the poorest part of the population composed of freed slaves and slaves. Now, all this tremendous development of Delos into a very important religious and commercial center will be abruptly stopped on a cold autumn night by the arrival of this terrible king, King Mithridates of Pontus. Pontus, a kingdom around the Black Sea, what is now the north of Turkey. And this king had been attacked by the Romans. He just got furious, and he decided to take revenge by attacking the Romans where it most hurt them. And what did he choose? He chose the little island of Delos, where the Roman colony that lived here was a flourishing colony. Furthermore, he chose Delos because it was an easy target. There were no walls, no army protecting the area, because the people lived peacefully under the protection of the god of purity, god Apollo. So in 88 BC, this king with his fleet will arrive, will take by surprise the inhabitants, start burning the houses of the people, sacking the sanctuary of Apollo, and slaughtering about 20,000 people. So it was a nearly total destruction, as you understand. Delos will never, in fact, really recover from that destruction, and slowly the inhabitants will start abandoning the island. Now, we know that between the 3rd and 7th century AD, we have a small Christian community established here, but after the 7th century AD, there's nobody living permanently on the island. So as it was definitely abandoned, dust and earth started covering the ruins of the sanctuary in the city until the excavation started in 1873, undertaken first by the French Archaeological School, and you can see along the shore the little yellow houses where the French archaeologists actually live, and work in collaboration with their Greek colleagues that have their little houses on the hill opposite. And these people, together with the guards, are the only people that have the right to remain on the island after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the site closes. For the whole island of Delos, as well as the island of Rhenia opposite, are considered to be archaeological sites. In fact, Delos is considered to be international heritage and is protected by the UNESCO. All right, I tried to make a long story short, as you understand. So these are the main points, so that you understand a little bit what we're going to see. Now, we find ourselves in what has been identified as a vast marketplace, an agora. That was the commercial meeting point of the Roman colony beginning of the 2nd century BC. It consists of an open-air courtyard surrounded by columns and little rooms around it that were shops. This particular marketplace was dedicated to the Lares of Compita, Roman divinities that used to protect the merchants. And on this particular marketplace would take place in antiquity one of the largest slave markets of the ancient Greek world, with as many as 10,000 slaves that could be sold in just one single day. As you understand, it's a huge number. And these were usually prisoners taken by the Romans during their long expeditions in Asia and Africa, and that was the fate of these prisoners, to be sold as slaves. Whole families were sold on this particular marketplace here, and were bought not only by the people that lived here, but people as far as Italy, for example, would come and buy their slaves in the famous slave market of Delos. All right, we'll start the visit with the most modern part of the island by looking at one of the districts of the city that have been preserved, and that is the district of the theatre. So we're going to follow the main street. If you want, we can start walking. So imagine grain, oil, wine, jewelry, perfumes, fabrics, fish, meat being sold along this main street. So it was a very noisy, very busy street. So let's start walking. So we're visiting now the, let us say, most modern part of the island by visiting a part of the city that developed here during this very short period of great economic development, beginning of the 2nd till beginning of the 1st century BC. Now, the earth completely covered this area. So when they uncovered the walls, they found them in the state we see them today. Very little reconstruction, in fact, in this area. Now, the material used to build the wall was very solid. It was granite, in fact, granite rock, and another very solid stone known as gneiss, G-N-E-I-S-S. Now, no mortar originally in between the stones. They were just covered by stucco, and you can see the original stucco in certain areas. It's the stucco of the 2nd century BC. And then they would paint the exterior parts of walls of houses and shops with an ochre kind of color. Many of the entrances of the shops or workshops are decorated with slabs of marble, and you can still see on the threshold, marble threshold, the holes for the supports of the heavy wooden doors that would protect the entrances of shops, but also of houses.
Ils vendaient certaines tuniques qui étaient vendues, ce qu'on appelle les amorianas, des tuniques ultra légères, transparentes, d'un lin spécial, coûtaient une fortune.
Je lui ai proposé. Ah bon, c'est comme ça. On se dit tout de suite. Si. Bah oui, elles sont pas envolées, mais elles ont bien bougé. Oui, c'est la moine. Et lui, columns or table bases, is that what those are?
Yes, these are original ones. I mean, they haven't placed them in the museum because they have a great quantity of them. You have a very good idea of how they uncovered the walls. You can see all the garbage and all these little stones that were piled in small hills or were dumped in the sea when they uncovered the walls, especially during the excavations of the end of the 19th century. Now they found in that shop here a big marble kind of table, if you want, with traces of slices in it, cuts. So they've named this the butcher shop, and here we have the fishmonger shop because they found this marble table where the merchant would probably lay his fish, and the water would be allowed to drain through that little hole in the corner. And then a little bit further up, where you see the two columns here, there's another workshop which is known as the dyer's workshop. For in the back part of that room, they found two kind of pools with traces of tint on the walls. So the merchant would submerge his fabric and dye it in these pools, and then he would sell his beautifully colored fabric in his little private boutique next to the workshop. Now, of a wealthy merchant, and we know that because the central open-air courtyard that allows air and light to penetrate into the different rooms is decorated with beautiful white marble columns. Only the very wealthy people could pay the cost of such a decoration in their house. Otherwise, the columns were made out of wood or they were made out of limestone. There's a narrow room in the corner just opposite, which are the latrines, the toilets, the washroom. It consists of a canal where water was flushing, and on top of it there were some marble seats, or wooden seats with holes. We haven't found them, but we know that the custom was, there were marble seats because marble is cold. The slaves of the house would first sit on the seats in order to warm them, so that then the owners of the house would comfortably sit on them. Now, come back to the courtyard. It's a vital part of the house. So not only does it allow air and light to penetrate into the different rooms, but you always have below the floor of a courtyard the private cistern of the house. Now, rain would come pouring from the roof, collected through that canal that you see here, driven into the cistern, but also through the open-air courtyard. Rainwater would be gathered, driven through that hole that you see opposite, that communicates with the lead or clay pipe, and would fill up the cistern. Now, the two half columns in the corners are the wells per se from where they used to throw the bucket and collect the water. You can still see the traces of the rope of the bucket going up and down on the well to the right. Now, the roof of the cistern is in fact the floor of the courtyard, which is decorated in most cases with this beautiful mosaics. You have a frieze with these stylized waves made by simple craftsmen, most of them coming from the island of Mykonos, which was a very poor island at that time, whereas the composition in the middle is a real piece of art. And again, only the very wealthy people could pay the cost of such a decoration in their house. Now, what is represented is god Dionysus, the god of theatre, the god of wine, and that is why this house is called the House of Dionysus. He's riding a panther, and falling on the right-hand side of that mosaic, you have the famous silver cup of Dionysus containing wine. Now, let me tell you immediately that this is a copy. For about 3 years ago, they had to remove the original one. They have restored it, and it's in the Archaeological Museum of Delos. Looking at the walls of the house, you will see that they were covered with stucco, and they used to be painted with vivid colors like red, yellow, blue. And I have here the entrance, for example, of the house. You see how it's looking like? It's very, very brilliant. You can see here, you see? So many of the important rooms of the house were decorated with frescoes. Some of them have been found and are now displayed in the museum, but also you have little niches you see in the rooms where they used to place oil lamps in order to illuminate the house during the night. Now, of course, the ceiling seems to have been quite high. It is not that the people were very high at that time, very tall at that time, but it is in order to allow air and light to penetrate into the different rooms. You needed They decided to erect the statues of themselves opposite the main entrance to the house. Somebody would peep in through the entrance, the first thing they would see. Now, this was probably the place of the courtyard of that house. And you see what happens when the floor of the courtyard of the house collapses. What appears is the cistern of the house, which is either a natural well or it collects rainwater. Yeah. I was telling you about maybe. No, sir. Your last you recognize another house, a wealthy house, marble columns surrounding it. And again, you see what happens when the floor of the courtyard collapses. Again, the cistern of the house. And you can see that the walls of the cistern must have been whitewashed in order to waterproof and preserve the fresh water from contamination by large-scale excavations that stopped here in Delos. Only small-scale excavations, because it is very easy to uncover today things and very difficult to maintain them. And only just so that you understand a little bit, 1/7 of the city has been uncovered till now. And the archaeologists have to restrain their enthusiasm because it's terrible for them, because they know that if they start uncovering things, they will find jewelry made. They continued a little bit further, they came upon a jeweler's shop. So, I mean, it's terrible for them. And just leave everything buried under earth, because that's the way it should be preserved. One more side if you want. You have a panoramic view of the theatre. But it's very much destroyed anyway. Who goes first sits. Only the few people there. Now the water that fills up the cistern was drained and collected through a canal that surrounds the theatre. And through three water openings, one here, one on the other side and one opposite, to the cistern and fill it up. Now here came to supply themselves with water, many kind of monuments you see here. So now on the orchestra you have the chorus and that is the dancing and singing part that accompanies a tragedy or a comedy that's performed. On the fourth stage you have the actors, only men, there are no actresses. They would perform female roles by changing masks. And then on the stage you would have something like large paintings. Now the capacity of these theatres of about 6,500 spectators. It is not a very big theatre. If you compare it to the theatre of Epidaure, which is in the Peloponnese, in the southern part of Greece, and which has a capacity of 14,000 spectators, and much smaller if you compare it to the largest theatre ever found now, which is the theatre of Ephesus. I don't know if you've been to Ephesus, where the theatre has a capacity of more than 15,000 spectators. What?
There's a huge frog in there.
Where?
Look.
Oh my gosh! Oh, I thought you said dog. And they would be following this procession avenue. Whatever you see is original. And that leads to the entrance of the sanctuary and was decorated. As you see, it's an entire temple nearly. Now, only the marble steps have remained today nearly intact, but very much destroyed by erosion, that is by the feet of the pilgrims going in and out. You can see a pillar or kind of column with the head of a god, like you can see it over there. The head of that god is god Hermes, the god messenger, but also why very few statues, and not the best ones, have been found and are now displayed in the Museum of Delos. As the light could penetrate through the marble at the thickness of 3 to 4 centimeters, they are very, very pure marble. So they offer this little temple. You can see opposite 2 enormous blocks of marble. Can you see? The light is very good. You can see very well the muscles on the back and the curly hair falling on the back. Can you see that? Now, these 2 blocks to the left hand, the Museum of Delos and to the left. Right, let's concentrate. Next to us we had 5 little one-room temples that were known as the treasuries by Delos, which means visible. But then the adventures of this poor girl didn't end there, because the jealous wife of Zeus Hera wouldn't let the goddess of childbirth come and help give birth. So she had to endure 9 days and nights of terrible labor pain. Until finally, some gods that took pity of her bribed with a beautiful necklace the goddess of childbirth named Pilithia, and she finally arrived here and helped Leto for reasons. And it still remains the most fertile place on the whole line, the only place where you can see like trees growing. And then the palm tree was planted by the French archaeologists during the period of intensive excavations between 1904 and 1925. So that is in fact the most venerated spot on the whole line here. For the end of the 7th century BC, made out of this beautiful Naxon marble. Only 5 were found in a more or less good condition, The 5 lines you're looking at are copies. Of course, the lines are a very good expression of the cycladic art that flourishes in these islands. And it's a very, very interesting art. Very abstract. You see that they're not interested in giving or representing if it's a male or female lion. What interests them is the outline. And you see that they have very geometrical lines, very abstract, and remind us to a great extent of modern art. The lines are looking towards the east, that is towards sunrise. That is where the lion is born.
There's standing in front of a palm tree, walking toward the museum. We only have 30 minutes left. Seems right there. Oh, it's the original size, too.
This is the original.
Whereas the composition in the middle is a real piece of art. And again, only the very wealthy people could pay the cost of such a decoration in their house. Now, what is represented is god Dionysus, the god of theatre, the god of wine, and that is why this house is called the House of Dionysus. He's riding a panther, and falling on the right-hand side of that mosaic, you have the famous silver cup of Dionysus containing wine. Now, let me tell you immediately that this is a copy. For about 3 years ago, they had to remove the original one. They have restored it, and it's in the Archaeological Museum of Delos.
There it goes.
On the slopes of the hill, you can see the houses where the Greek archaeologists actually lived. I don't know if you saw the little yellow house along the shore where the French archaeologists lived.
Granite is actually an igneous rock crystallized from a melt. Marble is a sort of a cooked limestone. It's been recrystallized, usually under pressure.
So where is Mykonos?